Well, now I'd like to turn to a segment that's really important, I think, because the best way that I know and how I learned a lot of the modeling that I learned was at a local club or a local NMRA division. And that's what we call our next segment. And Phil Edholm is the host for this segment for us. And we hope that by doing these segments, it'll give you an idea of what may be available at a local club or a local NMRA division near you, and may get you to a point where you want to go visit and see what they're all about. I hope so. So Phil, I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Thanks, Jim. It's really great to have this opportunity to kind of carry forward some of the learnings that different people have had. And I have a very interesting guest tonight who's kind of has risen to a role that's kind of a bit above local. And it's Frank Markovich. He is actually the president of the Pacific Coast region, but has had a long-term set of roles in the divisions as well. And I thought he brought an interesting view of the challenges, as we go through some of the changes in the hobby, of trying to keep, the region together, keep everything working together. But so, Frank, why don't you start off? Just tell us a little bit about, your involvement with the NMRA and kind of modeling in general.
Okay, thanks, Phil. I've been in the NMRA, I think, since '76. I became a life member somewhere soon after that, maybe '78. I've held in the division, in the Coast Division. I started running a youth program for a few years. I was contest chairman. Then I moved over to being the superintendent of the Coast, and then the director. And now they've pushed me into PCR president. So I'm a Master Model Railroad 514, I believe. I'm very active in narrow gauge. I run an event called West Side Reunion every year. And that gives you an idea. I have my own layout at home, and very active in the narrow gauge logging area.
So, Frank, what do you see as the big challenges, in terms of between divisions, within divisions today? Because I think you kind of see it from the level of, getting volunteers, getting commitment. What do you think the big challenges are today?
Well, the biggest one really is getting volunteers and finding people that are appropriate for the job. I've already in each of the roles had people that said they could do it, and then they're unable to. And there's a little dance to not make them feel bad, but to replace them. Because, for example, I had a chief clerk in the Coast Division who, by the time we got the minutes from the meeting, it was into the next meeting. And that was unacceptable. Phil, I think you've experienced that too. So that's a big problem. When I took over as superintendent, there were 5 or 6 positions that were open, and like a bull in a china shop, I just took all of them on. And that isn't good, because you can't do multiple things. And some of the stuff I honestly wasn't very good at. I had my own business, as an example. I'll take it away from modeling just for a second. I had my own business as an engineer, and I tried to do the finance part. And I realized that was beyond me, and then I hired somebody to do it. So you need to know what your weaknesses are. That's one of the big challenges. Another challenge is, in the Coast Division, a big challenge, and I think Phil's even going on with it now, is finding location. And there's a lot of requirements. So you have to define what you need and go out and look for it and find something that's affordable, that you're not going to lose money on. That's a big problem. I have a note here on that. And then another thing is keeping in the region. We just last year, I led a team to rewrite the manual of operations and the bylaws, because we had nothing in it about online stuff. And most of our meetings now are online, which has saved a lot of time and money. When I was director, when you'd have the mid-year meeting, you travel to wherever the regional meeting was going to be. And when it was in Bakersfield, I live in the Bay Area. Steve Skold was director at the time, and he lives in Santa Rosa. We had a long drive, and you basically had to spend the night. Well, besides the gas and wear and tear, there's spending the night. There's just a lot of money involved, where you can have a Zoom meeting or WebEx and do it all and spend more time on what you need to cover than on travel. And that's been important. The problem is, in our manual of operations, the meetings were supposed to be in person. So we weren't doing that for a while. Obviously, we weren't doing it during COVID, so we had to rewrite those. And right now, the membership's going to vote on a bylaw change. Currently, the business meeting, which is the last day of the annual convention, you need 35 members to hold the business meeting. That was set up when there were 1,500 members in the Coast Division. Now there's about 800. So we're going to vote on lowering it to 25, because there's a couple times we barely had enough. I was dragging people in almost off the street. So those are some of the big challenges.
So it's interesting that I think there's two challenges that you kind of referenced there that are interesting. The volunteers. How do we identify new volunteers that come in, or people that come in, new members that are willing to volunteer, or members that have been a member for a while are now in a position they can. And then I think the most important thing there is, finding and identifying people that can be comfortable in the role they're going into. And that's a real challenge.
And I'm not going to mention any names, but I've had people that volunteered and said they wanted to do such and such. And you get to know the people and find out, well, what are their strengths? And you need to grow them. You wouldn't move somebody into director until they sort of knew what was going on in the division.
Right.
And in the region, actually. So you need to be able to grow people, start them off in a simple job that almost anybody can do, so they learn the people.
Yep.
You need to know the people. And that's really important.
Well, I think the other point that you made that's really interesting is, we use Zoom as a tool basically to replace face-to-face modeling during the pandemic. But the reality is it can very rapidly become a tool to operate more effectively. And, one of the things, for example, of things that were isolated in the past. So if you had a region where you have 4 divisions and each one does a convention every 4 years, because they were geographically separated in the way people work, those tended to be totally independent groups of people. What we're seeing now is all those business interactions, those are really business interactions, have migrated to Zoom. We're able to open it up and have larger participation of people across those events. Either to educate people about what they're going to need to do. And I think there's a lot of powerful value in how you use this technology that we're just figuring out from the perspective of managing ourselves.
This week, this is my 5th Zoom meeting relating to the PCR. There was a regional advisory committee meeting on Saturday that lasted a few hours. A lot of good things came out of it, and membership will hear about at least a couple of them soon. But also, there's the convention meeting. Well, the convention this year is in Sacramento. For me to go to a meeting at 7 o'clock in Sacramento, leave the Bay Area and get up there, I'd have to leave about 3:30. And, it'd last an hour and a half, and I'd get home at 10:30 at night. So that's a problem. But now I can be a member of the committee, listen in on the meeting, give my input, and the convention committees, for example, now are pretty much have people from all over. The last convention had a couple members from the Daylight Division. Our convention was in Rohnert Park. The Daylight Division, one of the guys was from the Fresno area. And he went to all the meetings on Zoom. So that has really been a good thing. Now, we have there are some issues with it, but overall, it's been a really good experience.
Yeah, in fact, that's one of the things we've been trying to do is to begin to share those resources. Because, one of the things I think during the pandemic, we all of a sudden jumped into this, people were using it in different ways. And as Jim was saying earlier, you begin to realize there are costs that you incur. And quite frankly, most divisions don't really use a resource like a Zoom to a level that justifies the cost.
Well, I'll give you an example. Our Zoom bill for the PCR is right around $300. Constant Contact is $300.
Yeah.
The RegFox, which we use, I think that's the name of it, for registration, is 1% plus $1. So for our convention in Sacramento, it's $150 for the convention. So it's $2.50 out of the convention for each person. But it buys us the ability, like the contest, when somebody enters a contest, all their information's there. Whoever's the contest chairman, which is Earl, he can print it all out. He has all the information. He doesn't have to enter it. In the past, at the contest, they had to enter all the information in the contest room, and it would take 10 minutes for each model.
And I think there's another message there that's a really important message, is that sometimes it's better an organization like the NMRA or even a local club to exchange money for something that makes it easier for volunteers. Not just for members, but for volunteers. In other words, one of the things you see is a lot of times what happens is says, well, it's going to cost us $2.50 per person to do that. Gosh, that's a lot of money. Think about how much money that is. And you stop and think about it and you say, okay, we're going to have 150 people there. That's $2.50 times 150. That's $500. What are we going to do commercially with $500? Well, we're not going to do that. Somebody's going to volunteer to throw something together. And two things happen when people get really frustrated, and then you end up putting up something that's inferior. I mean, if you look at something like RegFox, it's designed. So I think that idea of using tools, but then sharing them is a great concept.
Right, which I'm trying to do with all of our tools. By the way, in your division, the auction, 3 or 4 times, you haven't been around long enough to know, 3 or 4 times people have offered to rewrite the auction program. As you probably know, it hasn't been rewritten because it's actually a big problem. It's difficult.
It's a big project. It's a fairly large project to do anything with technology. And if you can find, whether it's a Constant Contact or, the value, the thing that's so important is the value of the membership created by making it easy for volunteers.
Yes.
Because the challenge for volunteers is if you make it frustrating, if you make it challenging, and we've seen that, doing things, for example, on a show like this and trying to do it, it can become challenging. And so keeping it simple if you can, is really important. So
exactly.
I guess I'll throw it open. Jim, anyone else have any questions for Frank? Really someone who's stayed very engaged with the NMRA, and I think it really has been someone who's been a mentor to getting me through this process of getting thrown in the fire of being a young member coming into the NMRA and then in a role, and then of course having to deal with the pandemic, which was interesting. So
just a comment, as president and before president, I was on a number of committees, NMRA committees, and I and Mike Blumenstadt built the layout at the Train Museum in Sacramento and the scale model railroading exhibit.
Yeah, so if you go into the NMRA exhibit, there's a big model. It's about 12, 14 feet long. That's basically part of it's unfinished. So you see kind of the levels of construction. The rest is finished, but I think you use primarily commercial parts to
It's
kind of
all-
show what you could do commercial.
The requirement was all commercial parts, and everything was commercial with the exception of the wood used for the frame and the electronic components. All the models, all the scenery, everything was commercial. We did use real dirt, but that's about it.
And it is the only running trains in the exhibit. So it's pretty cool. If you go in there, you'll see it. Well, Jim, I think what we'll do is we'll throw it back to you.
Okay.
And thanks, Frank, for taking the
Thank you.
time. And we will talk to you in the near future.
Frank, I got a question for you before you get away here.
Yeah.
Where is modeling in your region? Is model building just out of style now? Are people still doing it?
There's a lot of diehards who are still doing it, but it's nowhere what it used to be. The guys that have sort of taken up the whole thing are the prototype guys, the prototype modelers. They're doing a lot of modeling, but we have guys. There's guys that are doing some really incredible things. There's a guy, Joe Piazza, who's doing some 3D printing of trucks, logging trucks and logging equipment. On the West Side Reunion, we had 11 entries, I believe. Phil can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was 11 entries. To give you an idea, 3 years ago, before the pandemic, 4 years, however long it was, we had 20 something. Yeah. So it's going lower. But what is increasing is the number of people involved in operations. The operations side is growing. One thing, by the way, you had an opportunity to see at Gorian Defeated. I did too. And I was a musician and I had a gig on the night I was invited. I should have got a sub for the gig. I've regretted that for 50 years.
And, Jim, I felt we were kind of running out of time and I didn't want to take too much time, but, one of the questions I was going to ask Frank is around this whole idea of mentoring. And so at the last division, at our last regional convention, Frank actually did a clinic where I think you built a storefront, Frank, that was.
We built three different parts of structures. Storefront was the last one, and hands-on. So it was like supposed to be an hour and a half, and it was 2.5, 3 hours. So when I do something that's hands-on, I schedule it right before lunch so that it can go a little longer.
Frank, what scale do you model?
Well, I've modeled in almost every scale you could imagine. I model mainly in ON3, although I was part of Yosemite short line, so I modeled ON30. I've built 3 HO scale models. Was an HON3 briefly. Logging HON3 geared locomotives when I started, they would run about a foot and stop. A foot might have been a long run. So I went into ON3, and then I built for shows. I've built with Mike Blumenstadt 2 N scale layouts. One that's a more normal freight operation, one that was a logging one. And believe it or not, the people liked the logging one more. But it was partly the track plan I think was more interesting. And,
well, listen, I've got some more questions. I'm going to have Phil give me your email. I'll send you an email if you don't mind. And
that's
maybe
fine.
Talk later. But Phil, if you could send me Frank's email, I'd appreciate it. Frank,
I will.
Thanks, Jim.
Frank.